Spare. We continue with the analysis of Harry's autobiography. He's learned that his mother is dead, and he then talks about the following day, or later that day rather, it being Sunday, so it was off to church. He doesn't really remember much about the day, but what is interesting, he notes that on the way back to Balmoral, people had been gathering outside and leaving cards and flowers, etc., and it was suggested that they stop and take a look. And he explains that when he did, he reached out and took his father's hand for comfort, and then says he cursed himself because the gesture set off an explosion of clicks, and he'd given them exactly what they wanted: emotion, drama, pain. They fired and fired and fired, he wrote. Now, it's interesting that, again, I find it a little bit difficult to believe that a 12-year-old boy would curse himself to such an extent of thinking, oh, bugger, I've given them what they want. They wanted emotion, they wanted drama, they wanted pain. I don't think a 12-year-old boy would be thinking in such terms. And this is the layering of adult Harry on young boy Harry, which, of course, creates a confused narrative. It makes him seem, of course, that he's far more perceptive than he actually is. But those of us that are sort of onto this weaving of the narrative see that all it is doing is maintaining his preoccupation, nay, obsession, with regard to the press, by going back and effectively saying, when I was 12 and I stopped at Balmoral and I went to reach out for my dad's hand, all of a sudden the press started taking pictures, and I cursed doing that because I'd given the wretched press pack, who I absolutely hate with a passion, precisely what they had wanted. I very much doubt he actually thought in such terms at the time. I think, if anything, you'd have been focusing on the fact that you just lost your mother, rather than worrying about what the press were doing. It is clear, however, that as time has gone on, Harry, and undoubtedly we will see this, I'm certain, as we continue the read through, that he develops this almost pathological hatred of the press and the media. This has formed as a consequence of what happened to his mother. It's formed as a consequence of things that he's been told. And it is no surprise whatsoever that Harry's wife was able to use this against him when she came along. Although it occurs in her subconscious, a narcissism, if it had a voice, would probably go, hallelujah, jackpot. He's got a vulnerability because of his dead mum and a hatred of the press and media. All we need to do is duplicate the concerns that we'll end up like his dead mum because of the media hounding us, being hateful, being racist, and he'll just go with what we want to do. Now, of course, Harry's wife did face criticism in the press, not racism, but just criticism as a consequence of her behaviours. Catherine did also. Other members of the royal family, particularly those that are married in, remember Fergie. She was referred to as the Duchess of Pork, and she was given a really rough ride by the media. So Harry's wife isn't the only one that's had a tough time, and some might say hers is more merited because of her behaviours, but it wasn't predicated on racism. But what she's been able to do is say to Harry, look how horrible they're being to me, this is racism, and they're going to harangue me, and we know what happened to your mum because of the press, and that immediately is a red flag for Harry. Press, my mother, absolutely can't have that happening again. I will do my utmost to defend my family. I will do everything I can to protect my family from the crazy UK media. And Harry's wife, were she a Bond villain, would be there stroking the back of a white cat, thinking, my plan has come together. Returning to Spare, Harry explains that his father, Charles, went off to Paris with his mother's sisters, Aunt Sarah and Aunt Jane, and he then was just wandering around the castle at Balmoral on his own. And it shows the doubts that were in his mind, because he thinks that his mother actually has gone into hiding, that she had been hounded and harassed, and as a consequence she'd taken the idea of going into hiding and the accident had been created as some form of diversion. And therefore he's thinking that she's in some apartment in Paris, or that she's somewhere in the Swiss Alps, and that she'll eventually say, come and visit me. And then that would make him feel a bit better, and then he'd be thinking, well, hang on a second, she wouldn't do that to me and my brother. That would be too painful. And then he would think, well, hang on a second, though, she would do it because it's the only way that she would gain freedom. And then he would think to himself, well, no, actually, she's a fighter. She wouldn't go into hiding. So young Harry there is vacillating between these two. His father returns, and with the aunts at RAF Northolt, and he then said that the next few days that followed his mother's death were like being in a vacuum, and he basically heard a voice arguing in his head about she's gone or that she's in hiding. And it shows the tumultuous mindset of Harry at this juncture. Then it was back to London, and he explains that he clearly was struggling to sort of have a chronological sequence of events at this time. And he then talks about the fact that one of his aunts had something for them, and it was 2 locks of hair from his mother's head, and that was actual proof, of course, that Diana was gone. And then he started to doubt himself again, wondering, in fact, if it was hair from just anybody's head. Thereafter, he talks about being outside Kensington Palace with the various crowds and the wet hands from all of the people's tears, and he talks about how he felt guilty because all these people were crying and he hadn't been. He talks about all of the flowers and how he hadn't been able to cry, and he remembers even consoling people as if they actually knew his mother. But in his head, he kept thinking, but you don't actually know her, which is fair comment. He explained thereafter they went into Kensington Palace, and there they found her coffin. And it was draped in a Union Jack, and actually it's a Union flag. It's only a Jack when it's on a boat. One would have thought that he would know that, or then again, one queries just how much involvement he has had in the finished product here. He then talks about how the flag mesmerises him, and it might be because of his patriotism, and then talking about the fact that people were up in arms because the flag hadn't been lowered to half-mast, but they didn't realise that the Royal Standard never flew at half-mast. It was just either flying when the Queen was in residence, or it wasn't when she wasn't in residence. He talks about the fact that the papers whipped the public into a rage. And interestingly, you may recall from watching The Queen, etc., which dealt with Diana's death, which starred Helen Mirren, there was the scene of where Blair was ringing the Queen and saying, your people need you, you need to show that you care, this silence and remaining distance isn't helpful, or words to that effect. And of course, the newspapers were running headlines saying, show us you care, etc. And once again, Harry's focus, to put it mildly, on the media comes to the fore. He states, they cared only about seeing some official show of mourning, and they were enraged by its absence. That is, they were whipped into rage by the British papers, which were trying to deflect attention from their role in Mummy's disappearance. Now, that's a very cynical view to take, particularly from a 12-year-old boy, thinking, actually, what you're doing is whipping the British public into a frenzy for the purposes of deflecting from the fact that you've killed my mum. Again, one wonders if he really thought that at the time, or that he's actually layering on more adult views and making it seem like he said this at the time. He then explains he's heard the official version about her death, and then he's thinking about whether his mum's a patriot because she's got the flag. And then there was the discussion about the next day's funeral, and of course following the coffin, and Uncle Charles, his mother's brother, raised hell about the fact that William and Harry were to walk behind the coffin, and he declared that it was barbaric and they shouldn't do it. Then, of course, the suggestion was that William would walk there alone, but it was decided to spare the spare, and instead it had to be both princes. And Uncle Charles was furious about this, and William said, I beg your pardon, Harry didn't want his brother to do this on his own. He'd never let him do it on his own, so he decided that he would go along with it. He then moves on to the morning of the funeral, and it's interesting in a way. It might be because he really can't remember what went on, but the detail's quite Spartan. It's quite strange in a way. He talks about where they were stood, and then he talks about feeling numb and clenching his fists, and he said he was keeping William in the corner of his eye, and he remembers the sounds, the wheels, the horses, the hooves, and talking about how he'll remember that for the rest of his life. It then goes on to being in the Abbey and Elton John with Candle in the Wind, and then Uncle Charles blasting everybody. And he said you could sort of feel the recoil from this blow. And then the Royal Standard was then draped around the coffin. And he wondered whether this was his mother being forgiven. But he couldn't formulate the questions. And then eventually the hearse drove off, and he talks about the size of the crowds and the route as the hearse went all the way up to Althorpe. And he explains that he and William watched most of the hearse's journey on television, and talks about the fact that people were throwing so many flowers on it, which of course was seen on television, that it blocked the vents and caused the engine to overheat, and so the driver had to keep pulling over so that they could be cleared. And then he talks about how the hearse got to Althorpe, coffin was removed and was carried across the pond over a green iron bridge, and that there was a photo of Harry and William placed on her. And he describes the fact that it was the two men who only ever truly loved her, and certainly the two who loved her most. And he says at this point that he began to sob uncontrollably into his hands, and he felt ashamed at this juncture of violating the family ethos, but he couldn't hold it in any longer. And he was just crying at the idea. He said, I wasn't crying because I believed my mother was in that hole or in that coffin. I promised myself I'd never believe that, no matter what anyone said. No, I was crying at the mere idea. It would just be so unbearably tragic, I thought, if it was actually true. And thus that's the recollection of the funeral. And I think it is layered, and perhaps in a way one might expect this with some of his views as an adult. But once again, you get the anger and resentment that's there towards the UK media, which in a way you think he perhaps not want to taint the memory of his mother by making reference to that. But it's almost a quite perfunctory run-through of what occurred, and interestingly, is relatively devoid of emotion. Maybe that is because he felt so numb. But that's the recall about the death of his mother and the funeral. Undoubtedly, Diana will get mentioned again. After all, he dines out on her memory repeatedly. But we'll learn more in the next video about what he has to tell us.